Today I'm going to talk about the SPICE model. This is a tool that's been designed to promote intersectoral work with clients who have developmental disability. It was developed in 2006 by developmental psychiatrist Jenny Curran and myself, Joanna Decore, occupational therapist, as a tool that we used in working in the child and youth specialist service team with young children with developmental disability and often a dual diagnosis of perhaps mental illness as well or behavioural difficulties. So SPICE essentially was developed as a communication tool. It isn't a researched model. It was something that we developed to help summarise a client's development across domains and how that might affect their everyday functioning. So for the SPICE, we used the analogy of a hand where S was the thumb for for social development or sensory. P was the index finger for physical development, and I, the middle finger, for intellectual disability, and ring finger C for communication, and E, the little finger, for emotional development. And we thought the use of the hand analogy was useful because in the area of development, we tend to use, there's the separate areas, but they all come together to work together to enable us to function. And when there's difficulty in one area, such as communication or emotional development, which may be as a result of developmental delay or an attachment disorder, it can really resonate throughout the whole of the person's functioning, and it can affect perhaps their communication and intellectual ability as well. And similarly, we also wanted to look at the person's strengths. So they may have had a real strength in their physical coordination and physical development, and also perhaps in their social abilities. And so kind of acknowledging that we can use those strengths to help them with their skill development or adaptive functioning, and perhaps to develop those areas where they were experiencing more delays, such as emotional development. It was initially designed for use with clients with intellectual disability or an autism spectrum disorder, and it's also found to be useful when working with people who have physical or neurological developmental disabilities, where the social, emotional and communication aspects of development have been affected but not acknowledged fully. SPICE places a slightly greater emphasis on the emotional area of development. As at the time that this tool was developed, emotional development wasn't really a domain that was considered much when we looked developmentally at clients. We more tended to focus at that point in time on sensory, physical, intellectual and communication, and we were really trying to lift and highlight just how much a person's emotional development was as important to consider in terms of their ability to regulate and engage with others, and also with activities without becoming overwhelmed, dysregulated, anxious, or and that kind of manifesting in different ways, different kind of behaviours. In terms of the different domains, the 5 different areas that SPICE represented or represents, the intellectual domain refers to acquiring skills and abilities related to memory, orientation, conceptualizing, comprehension, problem solving, judgment, executive functioning, problem solving, and so on. P, which represents physical and sensory development, refers to the process of growth and maturation, changes in size and function of muscles, bones, nerves, and organs. It's our kind of physical development as we physically mature. And often, for people with intellectual disability, this area of physical development may be more in line with their chronological development. However, the sensory processing part of the physical development may be something that does cause difficulties in terms of perhaps people's oversensitivities or undersensitivities in relation to the sensory information that they're processing from the environment, and how that can affect their ability to attend to and organise their behaviour meaningfully in response to the information that their brain is receiving, and how effectively their brain filters out sensory information to enable them to focus on the relevant aspects of that. C, which represents communication development, refers to acquiring abilities related to pre-symbolic or pre-intentional communication, where communication is essentially more non-verbal. It's kind of relying more on gestures, facial expressions, reading, tone, all of those kind of non-verbal parts of our communication, which make up a larger portion of our communication. And also our ability, our receptive and expressive abilities, moving beyond pre-intentional to more intentional, verbal, abstract, symbolic communication. At the time when we developed this, there was not a valid tool for a comprehensive assessment of the emotional development of people with intellectual disability, but there was a lot of work being done overseas in America by Dr. Stanley Greenspan, and also by a Dutch group who developed the SAID, and that tool was translated into English and used to assist our team with helping to understand a person's emotional development in more detail. Social development refers to the process of acquiring and using relationships, the ability to relate to another person, to understand another person's perspective, to be able to engage in, a mutual turn-taking process to facilitate, more socially directed, meaningful behaviour, and also how we respond to picking up on the cues of others, and communicating as a we in that kind of I and you relationship. And it relates to how children relate with their primary caregivers, their parents, perhaps with their peer groups, and other adults in different settings such as childcare, preschool and school, and maybe also in the community. How people relate to strangers and their awareness of, families, friends, acquaintances and so on, and the behaviours that are appropriate in those different contexts. Emotional, just going back to emotional development, the way that we defined it in SPICE was about acquiring abilities to manage and recognise emotions in oneself and in others, and that it's influenced by attachment style. It involves integrating feelings and values with knowledge and reasoning skills and experience. So there's quite a few different areas that come together, and temperament can play a big part in emotional development. I'm not sure if there are tools that enable us to measure our clients' emotional development at present, but when we did this, there wasn't, and I guess the SAID was probably working towards something like that. And I think probably in the area of attachment, there are a number of different tools that could be used to give us indicators and ways of getting a baseline around emotional development. But we can broadly determine whether or not emotional development is at the same level or vastly different from development in other domains. So just thinking about development in context and the environment or the ecology, like the hand, development always occurs in a context and it is essential to consider aspects of the social and physical environment. The hand engages in a context involving manipulation of the physical environment and in the interpersonal environment through communication by gestures and touch, building bonds with others, making friends, reaching out, and sometimes expressing emotion where no words can be found. However, it's important to see SPICE as only one part of the picture. It does not contain any reference to the person's context, which should be addressed in its own right as a major part of the client's current situation. We like for SPICE to be ability focused. So much of the disability focus in the past has been on deficits, while resilience factors or strengths have been underutilised as therapeutic tools, from initial rapport building to shifting attitudes towards the person to identify the best way to deliver interventions and supports. SPICE can assist us to focus our attention and think about a person's abilities and talk about these to others to enhance therapeutic work and help with building therapeutic relationship. We find that many clients have relative strengths in different domains, such as being strong visual learners and tuning into people's perhaps non-verbals. And in this context, it's important to think about how we can use those strengths to help the person engage more and think about their strengths and interests. Once the strengths have been noted and valued, SPICE can provide staff with a simple comparison of each developmental domain with each other. For example, a SPICE review can help the practitioner with little developmental experience identify where there seems to be information gaps. For example, in understanding the person's communication profile and whether it is useful to engage the services of a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist to do further assessment of their specific skills in relation to communication or other domain areas. Many professionals, as well as carers and family members, may not be aware that there are frequent discrepancies between domains. They may think that there's more of an even profile and that it is assumed that because the person has attained a certain level of communication skill, that this will equate to a particular level within other domains such as intellectual or emotional functioning. Whereas in fact, it's not unusual to find that where there are disturbed or challenging behaviours, there is often a mismatch between the expectation of those around the person, which are typically based on the most highly developed domain, and the person's actual overall developmental level, taking into account the least well-developed domains. There are 3 simple questions you can ask yourself once the information about the client has been put into SPICE, into a SPICE format. Question 1. Are the 5 domains at roughly the expected equivalent level to each other, or are there markedly stronger or weaker domains that stand out compared to the rest? Question 2. Can and do the strengths in one domain compensate for problem areas within another domain? Question 3. Are there limitations in one domain that have possibly held back the development of other domains which might be amenable to positive development in the future with appropriate support? We've also frequently found that where there are marked discrepancies between the development of an individual's domains, a new perspective on a client's situation and capacities is often generated as carers reflect that there may be other reason for the child's behaviour than the ones they had assumed. SPICE is a tool to promote good communication and effective collaboration. Effective services communicate well together, and it's well known that in order for interventions to be successful for a client, especially where there's challenging behaviour, there needs to be effective teamwork where people hold a sense of optimism and energy and hope for change. Where a client situation is complex, there is often a need to communicate to many key people with many different clinical backgrounds, non-professionals, family members, and carers. SPICE can act as a basis for the development. SPICE can act as a basis for the development of shared understanding of the client based on their functional development. It is then possible for people working together to have a shared basis of understanding, and this can often empower families and carers and offer a greater opportunity to engage in the assessment process and ultimately in strategies devised to assess the problem. Some other people in the team, Jose Copperman-Guthrie and Kate Hollett, also used the SPICE model but came up with their own ideas. So instead of using the analogy of a hand, they used a flower and 5 petals. So it's not something that you need to rigidly stick to, but you can be creative with it and I guess adapt it to what's most meaningful and what might engage the client and their family in a meaningful way. And I guess for working with a young child, they've found the flower analogy useful in their